We have with me now Stephanie Welch. Good morning, Stephanie.
Good morning.
And Rebecca Parr.
Good morning.
And I hope that you heard them say good morning. If you did, then we're probably in good shape. So we're gonna just kind of jump into this because there's so many things that we could talk about that we can't possibly cover them all. First, I'd like for each of you, and we'll just go. Let's alphabetically. Rebecca, you went both times, whether it's first name or second. So we'll go with Rebecca. So tell the listeners a little bit about your relevant background for the job of city council person, and how you've contributed to the city prior to this campaign, and what made you decide to run for office now.
Okay. My leadership role has been in the arts. I work with the School of Music Opera Theater program, and that's gave me a lot of responsibility in terms of knowing how things work. Now, what I've done civically more so has been with serving on the board of Community Action Committee, and that's also kind of what got me into wanting to be on city council, is seeing some of the issues that are going on in our city and what the needs are within our community. I also serve on Head Start Policy Council, and I learned a lot about the families and what some of the issues are serving specifically South Knoxville. I would say those are the major things that I've contributed to citywide that led me to want to be on city council. Also looking at what's going on in our community with the opioid epidemic. That really has spurred a lot of my interest in what can I do further to help our community. And that leads also into what does affordable housing look like in our community as well, particularly when I'm on the board of CAC and having some of those meetings and seeing what the issues are surrounding affordable housing.
All important issues, and some that we'll definitely get back to. Stephanie?
Great. Well, thanks again for having us on this morning. So pretty much throughout my professional career here in Knoxville for 20 plus years, I've been really actively involved in the community, serving on a variety of boards that range everything from nutrition and food policy to building codes and how that relates to the city. I have worked in public health and did some community-based work, helped organize some neighborhood organizations, and worked with schools and neighborhoods and city departments to kind of build an environment where children can be healthy. I now work for a nonprofit that supports public schools called the Great Schools Partnership. We have an initiative called the Community Schools Initiative that really works, again, sort of at the neighborhood level and at the city level, and with nonprofits throughout the Knoxville area. I've been in the Army Reserves for over 17 years. I'm the executive officer of a medical support unit in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I serve on the boards of Leadership Knoxville, IAMS, Nature Center, and the YMCA, and I'm an appointed member of the Zoning Ordinance Update Advisory Committee. And so really, I've had some great opportunities in Knoxville, and feel like I've grown and learned so much, and been really able to roll my sleeves up and get involved in the community, and have seen how a city council, a role on city council really has a huge impact on our community, and kind of understand what that means, and have wanted to bring my service to the next level through that role. So
we could easily just kind of play off of everything you both just said as far as the issues that we're going to face, certainly. But let's bring it down specific to South Knoxville a little bit, and to Fort Sanders, which, as we talked about before we went on air, this is an unusual district, one of the couple probably most unusual ones, in that it includes Fort Sanders on one side of the river and all of the city that's on the south side of the river, I suppose. So what do you see as the most pressing issues facing South Knoxville and Fort Sanders in particular? Not as much citywide, although I realize they'll probably overlap. And then how do you advocate approaching those issues? So most pressing issue for South Knoxville and Fort Sanders. And Stephanie, we'll stick with you, and then we'll come back to Rebecca.
yeah, it's such a fascinating district with both of those geographic areas included. I'm going to start with Fort Sanders because I think so often people just don't think about Fort Sanders as being part of the first district. So let's start there with just, I think there are so many positive attributes about Fort Sanders. It's just ideally situated with single-family and multifamily homes within walking distance of UT, downtown. It's just right in the center of the community, a high-density population. You have retail, commercial, residential, all in the same area, which has led to it being an attractive neighborhood, not only for students, who we think of as the primary population in Fort Sanders, but also for long-term residents who have really helped invest in that neighborhood and keep the historic nature of the neighborhood vibrant. But sometimes there are some challenges and tensions between all of those different groups that are living and working and recreating in the Fort Sanders area. So some challenges there. As far as south of the river, there's really been a huge movement over the past several years to develop the urban wilderness and to make South Knoxville not just a great destination for people who live in the region, but really internationally. We have people coming to South Knoxville to play in our urban wilderness in a variety of different ways. At the same time, we've had some new businesses that have moved into the area, and we've had a lot of interest from residents who are interested in living there. So that has been a great opportunity for South Knoxville, but it also has created some challenges around housing availability and housing affordability. So I think that there's a lot of energy, I think, in our district right now, and a great opportunity to help keep things moving forward while addressing some of the challenges that I've mentioned.
Right. So Rebecca, as you said, lots of good things happening, some challenges as well. She mentioned housing for one, and that's one of the things that you had mentioned when you were introducing yourself. So what do you see as Fort Sanders, South Knoxville, the major issues?
One of the major issues is definitely housing, because as we've moved forward and we've got a lot of development going on, we've lost a lot of the affordable rentals that have been part of our community and part of the setup where families could come, and traditionally generational families have been there as well. A lot of the homes are now being bought out at higher levels, higher amounts, and that kind of poses a challenge for where do the families go, and are we creating a gap that's going to grow larger for the marginalized community. And I don't know exactly what the answers are, but I do know that it's something that we really need to focus on and pay attention to, where the family's going to go, and are we going to create greater issues of homelessness for families. And that's been on my mind a lot, seeing that, because I've been there a long time, 36 years in Vestal. I'm a proud homeowner in Vestal. And I know that I've already seen the challenges. I don't know what the percentages are, but we've lost a great deal of affordable rentals for families, including KCDC voucher housing. The other issue that is definitely on my mind is the opioid epidemic, and we're seeing a lot in the community, particularly in Montgomery Village, some of the violence that surrounds that issue, and deaths. The deaths are staggering, and it's a heartbreak for a lot of our families. And what are we doing as a city? I don't know that we could do a lot about recovery, but what kind of efforts are we putting into spending for families? And I think that we need to look at the prioritization of spending. I believe the urban wilderness is a wonderful thing. I think it's bringing revenue and the small business, but are we prioritizing people before parks in our spending?
Well, and you know, we're going to get into this later. It's so hard to talk about a particular district because it's emblematic of really the city at large in a lot of ways. You're alluding to issues of gentrification, and you know, as things change and property values go up, it becomes more difficult for traditional families to hang on there. The opioid epidemic is certainly a citywide kind of issue as well. Have you given some thought to gentrification? I know I'm skipping way ahead. I'm losing the train already.
Yeah.
That's okay. Have you given some thought to that? Because I think, you know, it's difficult to say, well, I'm opposed to property values going up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's kind of crazy to say. But on the other hand, you're right. There are families who are being impacted. So, kind of, what are your thoughts on gentrification?
Yeah, I mean, I think gentrification is a term that's used to really describe a complex set of dynamics
Agreed.
in a community, and it's sort of boiled down and simplified into a word that tends to trigger a lot of emotion, and rightfully so. So on the one hand, we have neighborhoods that have been generationally disinvested, and there are some significant concerns about that. So over decades, there has been slow or stagnant investment in some neighborhoods across not just Knoxville, but really nationwide, and they tend to be urbanized neighborhoods. There hasn't been investment in new parks. There hasn't been investment in new infrastructure. And what happens over time is that the lack of public investment results additionally in a lack of private investment. And those areas tend to become areas that have a great stock of affordable housing, and that is a benefit. But they also tend to concentrate poverty, and it's not intentional, but that's what's happened. So then related to that, poverty concentrates in the schools in those areas. There's very little economic investment, and things kind of stagnate. So what has happened over the past several years in many urban areas across our country is and Knoxville being one of them, there's been a strategy to invest more public dollars and more public resources in those neighborhoods, which has then resulted in more private investment, and it's resulted in people who have homes realizing more value out of their property. I don't think that's something that we want to squelch. On the other hand, I think we need to be mindful of that because it does result in rental property values going up, and that tends to push people out of neighborhoods. So how can we make sure to create a balanced approach moving forward where we're not preventing people from realizing the value out of their property? We're investing appropriately in neighborhoods that haven't been invested in a long time, which has the opportunity to bring more diversity into neighborhoods. So we have the opportunity for people with higher incomes and higher property values. We also need to make sure that we're investing appropriately in smaller places that are more affordable for people to stay in those neighborhoods. So I guess I'm trying to describe this trend of gentrification in maybe a little bit of a different context.
Right, and I have read articles where it's a word that's used a lot of different ways to elicit a lot of different kinds of emotion. Well, kind of piggyback on that, and would you agree with that kind of characterization of how things happen, first of all, and if so or if not, tell us kind of your thoughts on that and how we might do that, because I mean it's easy to say, well, let's have small places safe for people who have lower income. It's harder to do.
It is. I'm not sure I agree on that it creates diversity in terms of socioeconomic, as it's more of a push out, the way I see it. Because the families who can't afford it and can't buy in new homes and aren't part of the new face, there's not a space for them any longer. And of course, anybody who has rentals, they're going to want more dollars, so they're going to do what they can to fix up the houses and either sell or bring in higher paying renters. So I'm not sure that creates a space for diversity, socioeconomic or and racial diversity. I think it's kind of does the opposite. And so I'm not sure exactly what the answers are, but I do know in looking at studies that if you have a socioeconomic diversity going on within communities, it tends to bring up the level of those in a more deprived place. It kind of will join up, and I know the city has put in a lot of dollars over time in loans, small low interest loans, to help communities like my own in Vestal, and that's helped even in our own neighborhood. I see the difference in the way people care about their property and what they're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're pushing people out. It just means that you're bringing people up, and the standard changes. What's going on in Old Sevier area, I don't see it as a place where we're going to be able to bring both communities or keep both communities the same there. I see it more as that we're going to lose a population of the marginalized that has been there. I agree that it has been a poverty-laden area, but I feel like now it's not going to be a space at all for those families. And I don't know what the answer is for that, but I do know that it's concerning me to a great deal.
Well, and it's a complex issue. I mean, as you both acknowledge, and there's probably not a single answer to it, but it's certainly one that's important. And I am aware that, gosh, we have like 5 minutes left in this segment, and
Wow.
I'm freaking out because I've got 27 more questions to ask, so I don't know what we'll do. Let's just work our way and see how far we can go. Maybe keep your answers brief here, since we know we're running out of time for this segment. So, do you view Sevier Avenue, South Waterfront as an extension of downtown? It's completely separate from downtown? Do you want it to be an extension of downtown? Do you think that's a bad thing? Do you want to make the connection stronger? How do you see that area, and what do you want to do with it?
What's going on with the riverfront and that area, I see it's a mix, because part of me sees it as just another extension of downtown, because even just the face of it, looking at what with Suttrie's Landing, that part was not really built with the intention of how does that serve Old Sevier neighborhood. It really, I mean, in terms of my view, I'm not saying what the intentions were, but when I'm looking at it, it really doesn't connect. When you drive down the drive that's very there alongside of it, you're looking at this fancy sidewalk riverfront park, and then homes that do not match up with what's going on there. Now, the small businesses have come in. I am in support of small business. I feel like that's something that brings vibrancy to a community, and it brings life to it. But I do see it as more of a push out. So where does the line come, and how is what's going on with development there serve the community that already exists?
Yeah, I mean, I
this is
think
Stephanie talking now.
yeah,
For the
this
radio
is
audience.
Stephanie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, our downtown is so geographically constrained that as the demand for a more urban type of feel has grown, and the need for all of the services that are related to a more urban type of feel, more walkability, more dense services. I think that we've started to branch outside of our traditional downtown boundaries, and that's not just, I think, South Knoxville and the waterfront and Sevier Avenue, but also along Central Avenue and into Happy Holler and other areas. So I see that as a benefit. I think we have to be very mindful, and I think Rebecca and I are actually on the same page here. We just need to be very mindful and strategic about not making that a push out. And I do think, and we'll talk about zoning ordinance updates in a little while, but I think that there are some strategies that City Council is directly involved with that can help prevent that from happening.
All right. Well, we have, I am told, like a minute and a half, and good grief, I'm just going to throw out 2 words: Chapman Highway.
Oh.
And I'm just going to get you to give us 30 seconds, 45 seconds each of what do you see the concerns there, what can be done to help it if you see concerns. I see concerns, I'll be honest, I'll own that. What do you see as the concerns, and how can we make it better? Rebecca, why don't you start?
Well, I'd love to see what's going on with Central happen on that corridor, the section leading up to Colonial Village. One of the things we talked about, I don't remember which interview, but if we were to slow traffic down and make it more of a destination, and ways that we can put more moms and pops in there, and even multi-use spaces with some of the older structures that are there, it definitely needs some help. It doesn't paint a picture of what we want our community to be representing for our community. So yeah, let's get some mom and pops in there. Let's figure out ways that the city can help with incentivizing and giving some, facial fronts and different things.
So
options
slowing
there.
down traffic for one thing, but also paying attention to kind of the aesthetics
and
of the...
walkability, et cetera. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there are a couple of issues. There's function and there's aesthetics. So Chapman Highway is a main corridor. So are there ways that traffic can still be moved efficiently, but also safely? And we're not the first city to have corridors like Chapman Highway. I mean, there are examples of how cities have been able to do some projects along corridors such as that, and the city is actually releasing an RFP to begin an implementation project timeline along Chapman Highway to help see what we can do to help slow and improve efficiency and safety, but then also through facade improvements, through changing our zoning ordinance, that in a way that will allow more mixed-use development along Chapman Highway. I think all of those things will be helpful strategies for improving that.
And sadly, it is time for a break. All right, so we're going to take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more. We'll talk about citywide issues in particular. We are back, and I've got Stephanie Welch and Rebecca Parr with me, and we are talking about the District 1 City Council race as well as the entire city, because for those of you who may not know, the districts vote, and the top 2 vote getters proceed to the general election, at which point the entire city votes on all the different candidates. So on election day, you will have to choose candidates for 5 different districts, and you'll have 2 candidates in each one with a write-in in one of them as well. So we're going to shift focus now. We're going to talk about citywide issues, because of course either of you who get elected will represent the entire city. There are way more issues and questions than we can possibly cover: environmental sustainability, walkability, multimodal transportation, fair and affordable housing, outside investment, how to deal with that, supporting small businesses, infrastructure, public amenities, and more. So I'm going to ask you all to just briefly say, maybe 2, maybe 3, what are some of the things that you think are the most critical things we're facing in the immediate future as the city goes forward. So let's go with Rebecca. Let's start with you.
Well, I've mentioned it already, but it's the opioid crisis and what we're doing with that. And also I'm looking at affordable housing, and I know it's a reiteration because besides what's going on with District 1 and some of the development there, we've also got that going on in East Knoxville, and they're paying attention to some of the corridor spaces, but are they focused on what's going on outside of the corridor spaces, and also what's going on with Park Ridge neighborhood and the historical overlay? Are we paying attention to push out in that community as well? So those are the top priorities, and I know I keep going back to them.
Well, they overlap and they encompass so many of the other issues that we're talking about, so I
Yeah.
think it's reasonable to keep going back to that. One of the questions that I keep coming back to in my mind, and I've read quite a bit on it, I don't have an answer for what we do about that housing issue. I think we're all seeing it, but knowing what to do about that is a struggle. Do you have kind of an emphasis? Is there something that you've seen, you've read about that other cities are doing, or something that with particularly the affordable housing?
Well, I did look at some of what's going on with, I believe it was Colorado. They were doing things with their project housing where they're bringing some of those standards up in those houses, and that kind of has a feel of creating community. And Greenville, South Carolina, they're putting a lot more investment into individual homes, and some of those are rentals, some of those are getting rid of project housing, but putting more of an emphasis, because there is going to be absolutely a push out from what's going on with the sprawl of the city. So are we paying attention to and looking at ways that we can get the TRI investment with church organizations, public monies and private monies, to invest in future housing for folks and get them out of project housing, so
Right.
that we're looking at ways to bring people up in a standard. The big issue that we don't have a lot to do with and can't do much about is living wages. So how do we bring people up into a place of being able to have a better lifestyle and join in with what's going on
Right.
citywide if they can't afford it? Because
Right.
the jobs aren't there, and neither are the wages.
So jobs becomes a big important part of it as well. Stephanie, you want
I think there are a lot of sort of issue-specific
There are. I
things
mean, we did a
that
laundry
it's
list.
hard to
But what would
hard
you
to
see as
focus.
most
So
important?
I'm just going to kind of bring it up just a little bit to say that I think that there are 2 things that a lot of voters may be not aware of. And the first is that in this election that we're going through right now in the city, 5 of the 9 city council seats will have new people sitting in them in December. So that's more than 50% of our council is turning over. That's big decisions by our voters. And in the next 24 months, not only will we have an all-new council, but we'll also have a new mayor. So I think a lot of times people are paying attention to what's happening at the national level, at the state level, but the decisions that are made by city council affect us more than many of those decisions. And so paying attention to these local elections will be really important. The big decision that City Council will be making over the next 2 years is updating the zoning ordinance. It will be controversial. It affects every aspect of the way our city functions, and I think that that's going to be, and it's an important issue. So I think the fact that combination of those two things becomes very important to me.
And it certainly impacts housing, and it impacts everything that
Yes.
we've talked about. So let's just go ahead, and I'm going to skip one question and go right to that then. Knoxville, through the MPC, is attempting to rewrite its codes through the Recode Knoxville project. So I'd love for each of you to talk about what your involvement has been in that, whether it's attending meetings, speaking out, or so forth. What do you see as the compelling reasons to rewrite our codes, and what would you like to see as an end result? What are some of the benefits you think we might reap from reworking those codes? And I'll switch over and hit Rebecca on this one.
Well, I've attended, I think 3 meetings so far, just trying to get an understanding of what the approach is. I think the last one was the most comprehensive in terms of letting the city folks know what the plans are and what they're looking at for some, not so much the individual, but kind of an overlay of what they're looking at. I personally feel like if we're looking at rezoning and recoding, that I hope that more city residents will get involved in the process, because it's going to affect every community. I'm in favor of looking at rezoning and recoding, because it's just layer upon layer of all these fractions, different issues over time in a community. So I feel like that it's a good thing where we land with it and how it affects the communities around it. Those are the things that need to be ironed out and looked into. I think Steffi and I both feel strongly that multi-use spaces are a good thing, and that could be woven into the coding, I believe, would be helpful.
Right. Stephanie?
So the zoning ordinance doesn't sound very exciting to a lot of folks.
It's hard to raise a rally around it.
It's a little
yes,
complicated, but I would just argue, having been involved with planning and urban planning for 15, 20 years, it affects everything that goes on in this city. So basically, the zoning ordinance determines how land can be used, whether it's commercial, residential, how it's connected with the land around it. And the current zoning ordinance was written 60 years ago. We had an entirely different set of values in our community 60 years ago. And we could talk about some of the social values, but just from a physical sense, the automobile was driving the way we developed. And it really resulted in a more sprawled community that, by many estimations, is just less efficient and more expensive. So, and a lot of separated use. So commercial over here, residential over here, institutions over here, and never the twain shall meet. So our values have changed, and resource needs have changed. So the zoning ordinance really will help, I believe, make it will be good for developers, because the process will be more transparent and efficient. It will be good for communities, because we'll get more mixed use, more better use of our taxpayer dollars. We have the opportunity to make sure that we're building into our zoning ordinance housing diversity and more affordability. And I think that is a really great way to use the zoning ordinance update process. And MPC is actually amending their budget to create more public input opportunity. So.
Well, and that's a good thing. I've been to several meetings myself, and while there's decent participation, it's not representative of the people out there who need to be paying attention. The other point you made there that I think is so critical is that we spent thousands of years figuring out how to make cities, and we made them pretty darn good, and they worked for people, for real people. And then within a 50-year span, we just threw that out the window because of this new invention, the automobile.
Yes.
And I think now we're realizing that we probably made some big mistakes in that way. I hope we're realizing that, and we'll see how it goes going forward. So let's shift from that, and I'm jettisoning questions as we go, because there's just so much that we could talk about. We've talked a good bit about affordable housing. Let's talk a little bit about homelessness. We do have quite a population of homelessness in the city. What do you support as a strategy to deal with that? Do you support a housing first strategy, for example? Just generally, what are some of your thoughts on the homeless situation in Knoxville and how we might do a better job? Because I think we would all agree it's not working right now very well.
Well, I was.
This is Rebecca, by the way.
Hi, I'm Rebecca.
People in radio land. We're talking to the camera and we're talking to the radio.
It's Rebecca Parr. I was able to serve on the liaison committee for Flanagan Landing, which was a wonderful reuse of space, school, Flanagan Elementary School, to accommodate, I believe it's 42 beds, I'm not sure exactly the number, and that was looking at well-vetted homeless individuals. There was some controversy within the community, but I think that there are greater and more opportunities for us to do partnerships again with private, public, even church, faith-based groups, to look at more opportunities to create homes and create dwellings where people, for larger numbers of people. And that's one of the things. We definitely need to be paying attention to what's going to happen with families, because that's more for individuals. And families, as we do this push out, just as it happens, as it occurs, it's not like we're intentionally doing such a thing, that we're going to I believe that we're going to have an increase in families, and that's going to become an issue. So paying attention to that now, what we're spending our money on now is more important and critical than what we're spending on money for what's to come, meaning putting money into the facade and parks and those kind of things. I think it's more critical that we put our dollars towards paying attention to the homeless and the potential homeless.
And you mentioned families, and certainly, I think there's a stereotype of homeless people, and that is the drug addict, the mentally ill, and certainly those are components of what happens there. But there are many families that are marginally housed and are just an unfortunate event away from actually becoming part of the homeless population themselves. But what are your thoughts on that, Stephanie? Are you for housing first, or?
Absolutely. So Knoxville has had a good strategy to address homelessness through the 10-year plan, and that was initiated during the previous administration when Governor Haslam was then Mayor Haslam, and was supported by the current administration. And that is a housing first model, and creating permanent supportive housing with the idea that we wouldn't be concentrating that housing in one part of our city, but that we would really be looking at creating more integrated permanent supportive housing throughout the city. It's not a popular notion among many people in our community who have fears and concerns and their own perceptions about what permanent supportive housing is going to bring to their communities. We've seen in the case of Flanagan Landing that it works well. And I think that there's an opportunity going forward to take another look at that strategy and revitalize that. And I don't know what that's going to take, but I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think that we can go back and kind of look and see where maybe that didn't work as well as it should have, and how we can continue to move forward with that housing first model.
Sounds like you both more or less agree on that. It does seem like it's gotten stalled somehow, that the momentum doesn't seem to be there. And politically it is difficult, and certainly that's an issue. And I've got 17 more questions, and you've got 1 minute each to answer all of them comprehensively. So let's look at preservation a little bit. One of the things that is always a controversy, or often a controversy, not only downtown, but if you look out at our corridors, every one of our corridors have some really great building stock, some buildings that are historically interesting or important to that part of town. You look out Magnolia, and certainly I had a question on the Magnolia Corridor project, so this will have to serve. Certainly out Chapman as well, and Central. What do we do to preserve these buildings? Because we're in a property rights city where people say, by God, it's my property, knock that building down if I want to, and you can't stop me. Certainly there's an argument for that. There's also an argument for the greater good community. So how do you feel about preservation generally? What do we do to preserve some of the character of our neighborhoods, basically? I'm looking at both of you, and I shouldn't do that.
All right,
I'm
okay.
forgetting myself. Stephanie, why don't you go ahead and
All right,
start
so
on
this
that one?
this is Stephanie, and I mean, absolutely. I think that our history is actually part of what gives our community character, and also is part of it's part of our economy. To be honest with you, I think that sometimes we don't realize how well we've done preserving some of our historic structures. When people come from other cities, they envy us in Knoxville. We have great organizations like Knox Heritage that's worked very well with the city to help with that process. The MPC has a historic overlay process that has helped preserve the character of some of our neighborhoods. I think we need to continue with the strategy that we have and continue to move that forward, which sometimes means that on a case-by-case basis, people are activated and become advocates for certain structures. In other cases, it means planning ahead and making sure we have that historic overlay or NC, the
H1.
either the H1 or the NC overlay in place to protect those places.
Last word, Rebecca.
Okay. Well, my mother lives in Fourth and Gill neighborhood. She bought her house there back in 1983, I believe it was. And back then it was a multi-family rental space. And there were a lot of individuals who were one step away from being homeless. The face of that community, it's beautiful what has taken place. Even my mother's home, she redid to put in for the historical overlay and the restoration. But what became of those families, what became of those individuals, and is that another area of push out? How do we have both? How do we preserve our history and our buildings and not create such an issue where we no longer have that housing available? So I believe that we're having a lot of those issues taking place now with Park Ridge and what's going on there. The Barber houses are beautiful. I love our structures and the antiquity. But how do we create a space where we have both, where we're not doing the push out entirely? I think that same thing with you looking at Old North Knoxville. There's a lot of old homes there that are beautiful, and I think it's great that we're taking care of that. But that also was a neighborhood where you had rental homes. You still have some of that neighborhood there. So it's a hard issue to look at because I believe in both. I want to have the preservation. How do you have it all?
Right.
And how do you then figure out ways to protect the communities
Right.
that exist there?
For the people who might be watching this on video eventually, I didn't just wink at Rebecca, although she's
did.
definitely charming. I was winking at Jonathan, who said we must now take a break, and this will conclude our conversation. It's been great. I appreciate you both being
Thank
on
you
here
so much
very
for
much.
having us.
And best of luck to both of you.
Thanks.
All right,
you.
we're
Thank
going to
you.
take a break now.